I'd like to call this hearing to order. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Budget Subcommittee number 1 on Health and Human Services. We intend to have a very rich discussion today, and we do expect to be joined by other committee members, but there are several hearings taking place simultaneously, some of them on similar subjects. So we will be doing a lot of movement and choreographing today because we want to hear from everybody. We ask that everyone just be brief as you can. This is obviously a very important issue for many Californians and a very important issue for me. I would just say at the outset, having served as a social worker for 20 years, I've had the chance to work with many families and consumers who've utilized the in-home supportive services program, and we think it's very important, and we want to move forward to action today to support the consumers of California who use IHSS. Having said that, I'd like to introduce our first panel. We're glad to have our director again, Mr. Lightbourne, who is here, and Eileen Carroll, who is also here from the Department of Social Services. We'll get a little overview on some of the proposals in the governor's budget. We have representatives from finance and from the LAO's office. Again, I'm asking everyone to be as brief as you can. You know, if you want to do it like 1 minute or less, that'd be great. If you feel the need to take a few more minutes, we'll grant that. We just ask that you give us the high overview so that we can spend as much time on the questions, and then we'll get to the public. With that said, Mr. Lightbourne, we're ready for you.
Thank you, Chair Thurman, and I'll be as brief as possible. IHSS program is one of the absolutely key supports that the state operates. It allows low-income, disabled and elderly individuals to remain in their own homes in the community in safety. It is remarkable in the country in that it is by far the biggest Medicaid-based home care program in the country. It is also remarkable in that it is almost completely a consumer-directed program. Consumers hire, fire, direct the work of their providers of care. There are approximately 446,000 consumers at this point. They are served by approximately 380,000 providers. The total budget cost in current year is $7.2 billion. The governor's proposed budget for 15-16 is for $8.2 billion. The caseload has been growing gently, I would say, for a couple of years, and a little more steeply in the last couple of years as a result of probably ACA MAGI eligibility expansion. I would just note that approximately 70% of the consumers are served by relatives, and slightly more than 50% living in their own homes. Let me just stop there and ask Ms. Carroll to go into additional detail.
Thank you, Director Lightbourne. So if you're looking at our slides, we're on slide 6. We're starting to talk about the major changes in IHSS. In 2012, they implemented legislation for the Coordinated Care Initiative, and that activity began in April of 2014 as far as implementing IHSS as part of a long-term services and support system under Medi-Cal and Medicare. It started in April in San Mateo. In June, July, it moved into Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and in July it was Los Angeles. January, Santa Clara began, and the last county that will go in that integrates IHSS into the CCI is Orange County, which is July of this year. Some of the changes in 2015, once we transitioned caseload for the demonstration project, will trigger a new statewide authority that's part of the CCI overall objectives. And with that, we have collective bargaining moving to the state for those counties as they fully transition their caseloads into the statewide authority, which in this case right now, as we move forward, we're looking at the first statewide authority meeting, which Director Lightbourne is the chair, along with the Director of Finance and the Director of Health, and 2 county representatives appointed by the governor. That took place February 23rd. It's the first county who has fully transitioned in. The rest will move in July, except for, of course, Santa Clara and Orange, which started much later than the other counties did. As part of CCI, CDS has contracts with managed care health plans. We provide them data downloads every month on our caseload. Public authorities in the counties have MOUs with managed health care. We've issued a variety of all-county plan letters and on the coordination care teams. And we also have the Home and Community-Based Universal Assessment, which is part of CCI, which is a work group that began in 2013, and we're hoping to pilot a new assessment in 2016. Additionally, part of CCI was a provider training curriculum, which required a stakeholder group of all organizations from counties, public authorities, all the labor organizations, consumers, providers, and we've put together a training that's on the department's website for voluntary training and IHSS activities. As I stated before, the first statewide authority meeting was February 23rd, and at that we gave out applications. The board addressed the new statewide advisory committee, which is made up of 13 stakeholders that are established in statute. Those applications are online. The next public authority meeting, this next statewide authority meeting is August 6th, and at that point the names will be chosen and selected and released as who will be on the statewide advisory committee. Director, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think the remainder, the issues of overtime and the 7% will take up later under those sections of the agenda.
Thank you. Anything from Mr. Nunez or from Ms. Pena from Finance?
Mr. Chair, Brendan Nunez with Finance. Department gave a great overview, so we're available for any questions you might have.
Thank you. Ms. Kriswani, anything from the LEO's office?
We have no comments at this time, but we'll be making comments as we move through the agenda.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? No questions from the committee at this time. So let us move on to the issue of implementation of overtime policy for IHSS. Mr. Lightbourne, take it away.
Thank you. To set it in context, the way that the in-home supportive services program in California was structured was both around consumer self-direction. They would be the employer for purposes of hiring, firing, and supervising staff, as well as a third-party relationship that the state would have for purposes of establishing public authorities in counties for collective bargaining purposes. So the providers in all of the counties are represented. Because also along with the creation of the program was structured under what is called the companionship exemption. That meant that Fair Labor Standards Act regulations relating to overtime and certain other compensable time did not apply to the program. For this reason, the way the program was structured was without regard to the number of hours that individual providers were working. In 2011, we learned that the federal administration was considering a change to the companionship rule under FLSA. State of California energetically observed to the federal government that the California program was far larger than that in any other state, far more expansive than that in any other state, allowed many more services than any other state, operated under a waiver that allowed spouses and parents to be the providers for their loved ones, allowed live-in providers, and essentially was structured on the premise that it was not subject to FLSA restrictions and that it would have an enormous impact on the California program if it were imposed. The federal government nonetheless issued the rule in October of 2013, and although the state had registered very strong objections, considered it very bad policy, at least for California, we began the process of preparation for implementation. We structured a system of capping at limited numbers of hours so that the amount of overtime, because the state, even though a third-party employer has a responsibility for cost, the state is not directing anyone. Most employers who have employees subject to overtime, the employer gets to decide whether or not they're assigning overtime in a given week or month. The state didn't have that authority under the IHSS program because the recipient was the employer. So we created structures to limit exposure. As it happened, in the closing days of 2014, District Court in Washington, D.C. Ruled that the Department of Labor had exceeded its statutory authority by issuing the rule, stayed first one part and then the entire rule, because the state had felt as a policy matter this was not good policy. When we were no longer obligated under federal law to implement, we stopped implementation in California. What this means is that all of the recipients receive all of the hours and services they have been assessed for without any interruption or inconvenience, and all of the providers may work all of the hours that they worked in prior years, 2014 and previously, at the locally negotiated wages and benefits, and there is no limitation on the number of hours that their consumers ask them to work within the approved limit. So just to underline the point, no one is in any way disadvantaged or the worse off than they have been historically in the program, but both sides of the overtime dimension, both paying overtime and then the restriction on hours, and most important, the restriction on recipients' ability to access hours from chosen providers, is not in force. We know Department of Labor has appealed. Oral arguments, I believe, are May 7th. There's an expectation that the District Court of Appeals may, or the Circuit Court of Appeals may issue a ruling as early as the summer. There's no betting on what that will be, but at this point, we are not implementing. Thank you. That's sort of the short version of a very long and compressed process.
Thank you, Ms. Carroll. Anything that you wish to add?
No, I think Director covered it.
Very good. Anything from Finance? Ms. Keswani?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, members. Rashi Kesarwani with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Our analysis does address the new federal labor regulations that required the state to provide overtime compensation and other payments to IHSS workers beginning January 1st, 2015, as Director Lightbourne has laid out. A federal district court has blocked these new regulations, and as Director Lightbourne noted, the department has halted the commencement of these payments, totaling $184 million general fund in 2014-15 and $317 million general fund proposed for 2015-16. If the legislature is concerned that the department could spend some or all of the 2014-15 funding on other purposes, then it would want to enact legislation specifically reverting these funds so that they would be available for any legislative priority. For the funding proposed for 2015-16, we recommend waiting until the May revision before making a decision, since we may know more about the status of an appeal filed by the Federal Department of Labor seeking to uphold the federal regulations. We also note that $37 million total funds has been provided over 2014-15 and 2015-16 to make conforming changes to the case management, information, and payrolling system used for IHSS. Most of these funds have been spent in anticipation that the new payment requirements would implement on January 1st. But depending on the outcome of the appeal filed by the Federal Department of Labor, there could be further changes that are needed to the payrolling system. Finally, the administration proposes a staffing request to address FLSA-related workload. We recommend that the legislature hold off on taking action related to the DSS staffing request, since, again, we may know more about the status of the federal court proceedings at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? I just wanted you, Mr. Lightbourne, if you would state again the number of consumers using IHSS in California, and what if that number represents growth or a decrease from previous years.
The caseload of recipients now is approximately 450,000 individuals. The caseload had increased quite significantly through the 90s and early 2000s, and then saw a flattening because of some new imposed requirements regarding medical certifications and other requirements that were enacted in the 2000s. Since then, we've started to see a gentle increase in caseload, and then in the last year or so, a slightly accelerated increase, which we believe is a result of the fact that Medi-Cal eligibility under ACA MAGI rules has become more readily available. But it is not a very sharp or dramatic increase.
To put some numbers attached to that, for 14-15, we had a 3.8% growth, and for 15-16, we project 3.7%.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from any members of the committee about IHSS or overtime?
And Mr. Chair, if I could just add, this is one of those programs that we know just because of the underlying demographics of California, an aging population, we will always see growth in the caseload. It's not one of those assistance programs where there is some future steady state where you can imagine it flattening out. It will always grow.
Thank you. You know, I want to ask the clerk if you take the roll for us, and then I want us to move to some action on these items.
Assemblymember Thurman.
Here.
Assemblymember Bonta.
Here.
Assemblymember Chu.
Here.
Assemblymember Grove. Assemblymember Jones.
Thank you. You know, we, with all due respect to the recommendation about waiting on the issue of overtime, it's obvious that there are Californians who are waiting and have a need to be able to have their IHSS provider help them with their needs and not be restricted by any overtime requirements. It is also obvious that the funds are in the budget, as the governor has proposed, and as a result, we're asking that the committee take action on it at this time. On the issue of the implementation of the overtime policy for IHSS, I'm going to offer a motion, and if there is a second, we'll take action.
Happy to second that.
Excellent. So I move to approve proceeding with the implementation of overtime as is currently prescribed by state law and funded in the governor's budget. Conforming changes are also adopted for the DDS budget, where overtime is funded for certain types of services. As part of this action, I also move to adopt placeholder trailer bill language to remove any perceived barriers to the state implementing overtime and the approval of DSS BCP related to FLSA implementation and CMIPS 2 changes. A motion made by Thurman, seconded by Member Chu. On the motion, any discussion?
I want to thank Chairman Thurman for making that motion. I have to admit, as someone who's been following this issue for a while, it's been puzzling to me how our state's home care workers who perform some of the most important work for some of the most vulnerable populations in our communities at some of the lowest wages would not receive the same overtime as others. And certainly since we have this pay that's already built into our budget, I'm happy to support moving forward with the implementation of overtime.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Bonta.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations today and participation in the hearing. I just want to echo Assemblymember Chu's comments and thank Mr. Thurman for the motion, Chair Thurman for the motion, and Assemblymember Chu for the second. I entirely agree that we need to act and act now with implementing the overtime provisions and also addressing the 7% cut. So thank you for the action that is on the table, and I look forward to supporting them.
Thank you, members. And on to the motion. Madam Clerk, could we have a roll call vote, please?
Thurman.
Yes.
Thurman, aye. Bonta.
Aye.
Bonta, aye. Chu.
Aye.
Chu, aye. Grove. Jones has 3. Passes.
Motion passes. Thank you very much on the overtime. Thank you. I'd like to also move on to our discussion of issue 3 today, IHSS restoration of the 7% across-the-board hours reduction. We have an unusual circumstance in that at the same time that this hearing is taking place, there is also a health committee meeting taking place. It's a joint hearing between the Assembly and Senate health committees. And as it turns out, all 3 of the members of this subcommittee are also members of that health committee. Mr. Bonta chairs it. Mr. Chu and I are both members of that committee. As a result, unless there's objection from the committee members, I'd like to take action on issue 3, which is IHSS restoration of 7% across the board hours reduction. Unless there's any objection from the members, I'll just go ahead and make that motion. I move to approve restoration of the 7% reduction in hours effective July 1, 2015. This action is supported by the presumed proceeds of the MCO tax as reconstructed in the governor's budget, but is not contingent on the MCO changes as included therein. To be clear, this action is to restore the 7% regardless of the funding source. That is the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
A motion made by Thurmond, seconded by Assemblymember Chu. Any discussion on the motion? Madam Clerk, could we have a roll call vote on the motion?
Thurman?
Aye.
Thurman, I. Bonta?
Aye.
Bonta, I. Chu?
Aye.
Chu, I. Grove? Jones has 3.
A motion carries. Thank you, members of the committee. We do want to give the panel an opportunity to discuss the restoration of the 7% across the board hours. We know that there are panelists who want to speak. We'll also invite the public to speak. We thank you for your attentiveness to this matter, and members of the committee. We know that you also have other business, and if you're not able to stay, we appreciate and support you for taking this action at this time. So why don't we go ahead and get started, Mr. Light.
No additional comments.
Okay. Joseph Berry, we'd like to invite Joseph Berry to come forward. Brenda Jackson and Della Lundell and Greg Thompson. Forward.
You still want me to?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're always welcome here, Ms. Cantwell. Always glad to have your presence.
I'm just going to stay. I don't know if there's space.
Ms. Cantwell, if you want to give us some overarching remarks on this
Sure.
matter. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm here today just to do a brief overview of the MCO tax component of the restoration of the IHSS, notwithstanding obviously the action that the committee just took. So very briefly, the governor's proposal does include doing a new MCO tax to replace our existing Medi-Cal managed care MCO tax for 2 purposes. One, to fund the offset of the 7% reduction in IHSS hours, and the second, to replace our existing MCO tax, which the federal government has informed us is no longer permissible. So I'll just stop there, and if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, but otherwise, I'm good.
Thank you, Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Berry.
No, I just want to say thank you for making the movements and motions that you did earlier. I don't really have much to say in that, since that occurrence, but yeah, thank you. It's been a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. We appreciate you coming to the committee today, and we appreciate your work on behalf of the IHSS Coalition. Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I too also want to thank you on behalf of SEIU, United Long-Term Care Workers Union. My name is Brenda Jackson, and we have been fighting year after year after year. There's always some type of cut on the table, and for everybody that's here, we were all born at one time with dignity, and this union and our members and our consumers are still fighting for dignity. It seems like every day we have to, we get it stripped away, or try to strip away and attack our dignity. But we want to just remind the committee, we want to thank you first, but we also want it to be passed on to let everybody know that we really need our hours restored, because every time there's a cut, or every time there's an assessment, not a cut, but assessment of the hours, when a social worker comes out to assess a consumer, and whether they reduce their hours or not, that 7% is cut, and it takes away hours that the consumer needs work for. It takes away funding for us as providers, and it hits us hard financially. And we're already low-wage workers. we're taking care of low-income consumers, and we really do need to keep the 7%. I mean, to have the 7% restored. But as you've already said, that you also agree with us, so I want to thank you for that. But I did want to let you know that we really do need that, and those are some of the reasons why. But whether they take the away hours or not, they're still cut doing the 7% reduction. So every year will continue to be reduced by 7% if that stays on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson, and I want to thank you and your members for bringing dignity to the conversation. We often say here that it is an honor to serve, and we want to make sure that all Californians are served well, and particularly our Californians who use the IHSS program. Thank you for your advocacy and your passion. I know Mr. Bonta is proud to have you in his assembly district, and we claim you in the 15th too.
I'm proud of him too.
We're glad to have your passion and advocacy here today, and your members.
Thank you.
And just give a shout out to your members who are here today as well. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Yeah, Della Lindell.
That would be
Hi.
me.
Hi, Lindell.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking this time to listen to us today. My name is Della Lundell, and I have been a home care giver for my son Stephen for 24 years, 5 of them as a paid IHSS employee. This is more of a personal story, just to let you know how this affects us. I grew up in a rural dairy farming community of Merced County, in which I still live today. I married my high school sweetheart, and our journey began like a lot of other people's. Before we started our family, we wanted to make sure that we had good jobs, health insurance, and, we wanted to be prepared. We were married for 10 years before we bought our first home and had our first son. And we thought we were prepared. We had no idea how our lives were about to change. Our first son was born in 1991. His name is Stephen. He was born with Down syndrome, lung disease, and a heart defect. No parent ever expects this. When we realized how much care Stephen was going to require, my career changed. My career changed from real estate to a caregiver. And my husband took on a second job to generate more income so I could attend to our son at home. These were difficult times for us, but we persevered. Then in 2009, due to the economy, we lost our second job. And that is when I began working for IHSS. At $9 an hour, it didn't replace the income that we lost by far, but it did keep our heads above the water. But just as we thought we could breathe, the cuts to the IHSS program started to hit us. First, the 3.6% reduction in 2011, and then the 4.4% in 2012. Stephen requires round-the-clock care and protective supervision, and this leaves very little time, if any, for me to have an outside job to help provide extra income. And this is why restoring the 7% cut to hours is so important. As an IHSS provider, I am doing a job. I am caring for Stephen, and I am also expected to be a productive member of society and pay my bills. This is very difficult to do when our income keeps vanishing. Life for us is already difficult, challenging, mentally, physically, and financially when you care for someone that you love with a disability. We have to worry every time we check the mail. She mentioned every time you have an assessment. Every time I check the mail and see a letterhead, I just get sick to my stomach wondering what's going to be cut next and how are we going to survive. We don't need that extra, that extra worry. It's hard. I'm sure that you have college degrees, careers, incomes, benefits, retirement, sick leave, Social Security retirement. Well, I stand before you with no college degree, none of the benefits that I just mentioned. But what I do have is years of experience and a conscience. When my career changed to caregiver, it changed to a nurse, a respiratory therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, behavioral analyst, dietitian, teacher, transporter, translator, and more, protective supervisor. all for $9 an hour. Some home care providers choose this career. God bless those individuals that do. My career was chosen for me, and I thank God for that opportunity. Remember, you, a family member, or me, were only an accident or an illness away from needing the services that we provide. And obviously, you guys get that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Lundell, for your testimony and for what you shared, your experience and experience for Stephen and all the great work that you're doing on behalf of your family. I'm sorry for what you've had to endure vis-a-vis all the trauma that you described when there's a letter coming that might mean bad news.
Yeah, I'm not the only one that feels that way. There's, I didn't finish, I guess. I have one more page.
I think you've earned the right to finish. Go ahead, please do.
I just wanted to say, and you are helping us, but for the ones that aren't here today, that maybe need to be encouraged, I don't know, please help us, help the people who need it most while helping the state of California save money. Because on an average, the annual IHSS per client cost is 80% less than at a skilled nursing facility. And, if I worked at a skilled nursing facility or for a fast food restaurant for that matter, putting in the hours that I do, I would be paid overtime. I represent approximately 66,000 UDW home care workers and over 400,000 home care providers in California. We deserve better. Thank you. Now I'm done.